Could be other things. There was talk it was related to a debt that somebody ran up in the late 1990s Asian currency crisis, but that wouldn't explain why a judge had to seal the records, and that fellow came forward anyway and said that the numbers involved were far, far less than 430 million. So it's not that. A barrel of naked shorts would explain it. It's the kind of liability that persists. You can't write it off. There are people out in the world who own or think they own the stock, but in this case, the folks who owe it to them are gone. Of course, the SEC won't disclose what these FTDs are because it would reveal the trading strategies of folks like Rhino and Amro and Revco, and that would be wrong because the proprietary illegal trading strategies of Panamanian financiers and shadowy Austrian bankers could backfire on them if the stocks they targeted went up, and the SEC thinks that would be wrong and unlawful. I may be wrong about Revco's barrel of financial toxic waste, but let's pretend I'm right, if only to bracket the problem. If there are 100 million fails of Sedona, that's 14 million of toxic waste. So at 430 million, the Revco problem would be 30 times the Sedona problem. And that would explain why Revco's collapse made people worry about the risk of systemic failure enough to have a judge seal it. Larry Thompson says that the whole DTC problem is 6 billion, which would be 14 Revcos. And that's not counting the problem of X clearing outside the DTCC, which makes the whole thing at least 5 times bigger. And none of this includes the Amex or the bulletin board companies or delisted companies or offshore clearing groups, where I believe these FTDs are shifting. Nor does it include entire classes of FTDs that enter the system in ways other than I've been describing. But this would explain the SEC's odd behavior. We have come to the end of the main part of this presentation on corruption in our capital markets. I know it's been dense at times, and for this I apologize. If you're intrigued enough to want to know more, this continues with some shorter but more technical postscript thoughts. But if you've watched to this point, then you have gotten the big picture, and for your attention, I'm grateful. Thank you. Still with me? I'll give you a short mental break by talking about the term grandfathering. After the American Civil War, many Southern whites didn't want newly emancipated black people to vote, so they passed Jim Crow laws. They were poll taxes and literacy tests. Poll taxes simply raised the price of voting to discourage poor people from doing it. Literacy tests ran something like this. You can vote if you can recite the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence from memory. So not many black people got to vote, but the law had a clause that said if your grandfather could vote, then you don't have to pass the literacy test. So white people could keep voting. That's where grandfathering comes from. So my point is sometimes it's a good idea if it's, passed to keep people from having to rip down the 5th story of a building or something. Grandfathering makes sense. But if you're talking about a system that has a deep problem and you pass a rule to fix the problem, but then you grandfather the problem, all you've done is create the appearance of law, but no actual law. And that's probably even worse. I switch now to an area of economics called public choice theory, which deals with the decision-making of government agents. The Interstate Commerce Commission was the world's first regulatory body. First, they regulated interstate railroads, but in 1935 they expanded their mandate to include interstate trucking. As they had with railroads, they set tariffs for trucking. If you were trucking a load from Chicago to Miami, believe it or not, the ICC set the price, not the market. It sounds like the USSR or Albania, but that's how it worked for 40 years. And they set trucking rates artificially high so that everybody in the business made a ton of money, and they gave few licenses to new firms trying to get in on it. Well, why did the regulators act so as to encourage mega profits for the industry they were regulating? The answer is regulators often get captured by those they regulate. Sometimes they just get too close. They spend too much time with them. That's called psychic capture. Outright bribery is a possibility. I believe that happens more than many are aware. But mainly the ICC regulators came to know that if they were good boys and regulated lightly, that after 20 years there would be board seats at the trucking companies they had been regulating. They could retire to these seats and earn a lot of money for not doing much. So in one way or another, the trucking regulators are said to have become captured by the trucking industry. There's a special case of captured regulators called the problem of dispersed costs and concentrated benefits. I'll illustrate this with sugar, which costs 23 cents a pound at retail around the world. In the U.S., the price is about 43 cents a pound. And we pay an extra 20 cents a pound over world price because we have a quota that prevents American consumers from buying cheaper sugar. The average American consumes about 60 pounds of white refined sugar a year, gross, and 20 cents times 60 pounds is $12 of additional cost per consumer. There's 300 million consumers, so times $12 is an extra $3.6 billion cost to consumers. The quota generates an extra $1.7 billion revenue for growers. I'd have to get into the wholesale pricing tables to show you that, so I'll skip it, but just take my word for it. $3.6 billion cost minus the $1.7 billion benefit comes to a $1.9 billion cost. There's a link at the top of the page that goes into this. Their pricing numbers are out of date. They calculate a slightly lower total cost, but then they add in $1.8 billion for government and words. No matter how you slice it, the quota cost about creates a net $2 billion cost or so to the. Why retain a quota that costs the U.S. $2 billion? The answer is found in Washington, which I depict with a picture of Congress. But Washington's a lot more than Congress. It's departments of agriculture and K Street lobbyists and all kinds of things. Just show it with a picture of Congress. Whom does the quota cost? It costs 300 million people scattered around the country, $12 each. Whom does it benefit? It benefits a few dozen corporations that grow sugar. Two of them in one state get the lion's share of the benefit. The consumers, whom it costs, are not self-aware or politically organized. They don't all go to D.C. to save themselves $12 a year. But the corporations are few. They are self-aware. They're organized. They lobby for their interests. They sprinkled $13 million on the halls of Congress last year, in form of donations to keep things from changing. In that environment, it's natural for the political compass to deflect by creating a quota which drains $3.6 billion from unorganized consumers and delivers $1.7 billion to a few dozen organized corporations. This occurs with Democrats and Republicans. It occurs within democracies and authoritarian regimes and regulatory environments. It's just the nature of politics to create systems of dispersed cost and concentrated benefits. So please stick a pin in that, and we'll come back. I'm going to talk now about the history of the SEC. And I'll start by extending my apologies to people who work there. I've known many people who work in government and know that nobody goes in wanting to do a bad job. The SEC has a few thousand hard-working folks who, in most respects, do a good job, and they're operating on a tenth of the budget that I wish they had, and it must not be fun to have some jerk you never met criticizing you. On the other hand, I think there's a problem, and I don't have any way of addressing it without being critical of the SEC. So I apologize in advance for any feelings that I hurt. That's neither my style nor my intent. To understand the history of the SEC, a good place to start is by asking what was life like before the SEC. On its 25th birthday in 1959, the SEC produced a history. It's quoted from in the paper, whose link is shown, described life before the SEC, that is, before 1934, as a situation wherein no one could be sure that market prices for securities bore any reasonable relation to intrinsic values or reflected impersonal supply and demand. In fact, the investigation record demonstrated that during 1929, the prices of over 100 stocks on the New York Stock Exchange were subject to manipulation by massive pool operations. Okay, that's what they say. What's a pool? In the 1920s, rich guys would pool their money together and manipulate stocks. Often they do that by running the price of the stock up, and as the public jumped into it, they would bail out and short it down. This went on regularly. In fact, the shenanigans of pools were followed in the press, who looked at it as good sport. Back then, it wasn't called a hedge fund, it was called a pool. They talked about it like we now follow basketball or the NFL, or as some in the press now root on certain hedge funds.